So let me just, first of all, welcome all of you tonight. This is our second in what is going to be a semi-weekly, I don't want to quite commit to saying weekly, but semi-weekly webinar series, an international series where we're going to bring folks on from around the world who have authority and a background to speak on a particular area of men's and boys issues. Tonight is a special treat to welcome back to a cafe event, very close friend of the organization and one of our advisors, Professor Lionel Tiger. So good of you to join us. Thanks so much for being here with me and with the group. Before I introduce Dr. Tiger, just want to give the ground rules. So if you were there last week, some of this will be familiar, but there's a bit of a twist, so hear me out. We're going to hear from Dr. Tiger for about 40 minutes. We're then going to take Q&A. I'll ask that you keep your questions fairly concise so we can get through as many as possible. What we'll do is we'll ask you to put your hand up. And if you know your way around Zoom, I think that's an easy thing to do. But if not, what you want to do is look for the drop-down menu beside your name, and that should allow you to, quote, raise your hand. I can then give you the ability to speak, and then you can ask your question to Dr. Tiger. We did have a couple of people after last week who had asked questions but didn't want to have their question actually part of the official record that we're putting up on YouTube. So we're going to honor those requests, but to make it a little bit easier on our editing team, I'm going to ask you, if you don't want to have your name sort of known by the wider community beyond this space, please change your name now, or perhaps when we get to the Q&A period at least, to just your initials. That way, when we call on you, you won't be identifiable. We'll preserve your anonymity that way. If you don't care, then just leave your name as it is, and that's perfectly fine. But this is being recorded, and in fact, today it's being live streamed on YouTube. We're going to just kind of experiment live streaming it in some different social media places. So today it's going to be up on YouTube on our YouTube channel, Equality Canada TV. And by the way, we put up some new content. We've launched a video series called Cafe Take Two. First episode went up this week. That's on that same YouTube channel, Equality Canada TV. So let's get to the main event. We're all here to hear from Professor Lionel Tiger, who is the Canadian-born Charles Darwin Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University. He's also co-research director of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation and the author of several truly groundbreaking books, including the very pioneering Decline of Males. And then there was Men in Groups, which I think was published, Lionel, you were saying, in the late 60s, and essentially coined the term male bonding, a concept that I'm sure Lionel will talk a little bit more about today, and what the consequences of introducing that concept has been to our discourse around men's issues. And then he also authored the book, The Pursuit of Pleasure. He's also a frequent contributor to Psychology Today, the New York Times, and many other publications. And just on a quick personal note, I just want to remind us that Dr. Tiger gave the first presentation at the public launch event for the fundraising campaign, which culminated in us opening the Center for Men and Families in Toronto. And so it's really great to have you back. What is it, 7 years later? Almost exactly 7 years. So sorry you can't be with us in Toronto, but that will come soon, I'm sure. But for now, we're bringing him live via the wonders of modern technology. Professor Tiger, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding me of my role in that first formal event, which led to the development of a place for you guys and gals to live and prosper as you have. It's my pleasure, of course, to be here. I've been identified with this basic issue of gender in the social marketplace for many, many years, coming from a rather basic interest also in what you might call, in prosaic terms, human nature. Somehow, if you look at universities, and I'm sure this is true of most universities in Canada, it certainly was the case when I taught in British Columbia and I was a student at McGill. There are two sections in many universities, not necessarily totally formally defined, but actually functionally so. One is the natural sciences, and the other, weirdly, is the social sciences. And the heavy implication of that is that social behavior somehow is not natural. Well, that's a bit of a leap. And we have to remember that Charles Darwin made it very clear that not only was human behavior natural, but it evolved in a method of sexual selection, which now we understand far better. But for many people, there remains the distinction between the natural and the social sciences. And that seemed to me, when I was a younger professor and kibitzer around town, that this was absurd. It was totally absurd, because clearly we're a species like no other. We have, in fact, many similarities with other primates. We can identify those. We can go to the zoo and laugh at how similarly we behave to some of the things that the chimps and the macaques and the baboons and others do. But we see our kinship with other animals, and it's discernible by the forms of science that we now have about the evolution of the human genome. We can know far more about how the social is natural. In any event, my first concern was to try to identify how men and women differed, only because it seemed to me that we were assuming that males and females were the same. And it's now been years and years, decades actually, for the community to realize that you put two human beings, 6 years old, 5 years old, in a schoolroom, 10 years later you've got different products, if one is a male and the other is a female. I'd like today not to belabor that kind of anguish that comes along with feeling that the feminist or femalist, however you want to call it, movement has made it quite clear that males are unscrupulous. There's toxic masculinity is a favorite phrase of many commentators in certain parts of this discussion. And how can you have a species in which one half is toxic? Or if the characteristics of one half is toxic? It would, of course, as we know from toxicity in natural science and environmental science, you can't survive with toxicity. I would like then to go to some fairly simple-minded but broad and hence maybe interestingly new thinking about old things. Let's look at two important figures in our intellectual history who both had profound impacts on our civilizations, on our ways of thinking, on our sense of fun, our sense of fear, our sense of pleasure. One, of course, was Charles Darwin himself, because what Darwin did, and if you read his book such as The Expression of the Emotions in Animals and Men, you realize he was not only an impeccable and careful scientist, he had an imaginative love and zest for behavior and trying to understand it, which changed the world. There is no question that Darwin's books were utterly fundamental to how we see ourselves and how we live. The other individual who had not as much an impact in science terms, not that much actually in scientific terms, but certainly considerable impact in social or political terms, the other person was Karl Marx. Now, I know you didn't decide to give up your second beer in order to hear somebody talk about Marx and Darwin. So I just want to emphasize that I'm talking about these storied, historic creatures, people, because we still live by many of the both discoveries and mistakes they made. Darwin had a book, a notebook. I don't know, now can't remember how he called it, but basically it was Charles Darwin's book of mistakes. He tried to make sure that he got everything right. Karl Marx was not quite so assiduous, and he didn't have the same scientific sense of things. But he felt he was doing his kind of science, and as a matter of fact, he sent his famous book Das Kapital, which was required reading in communist countries and communist communities, to Darwin, and expected him to read it, or wanted to acknowledge that he, Marx, was as important in the social sciences as Darwin was in the physical and evolutionary sciences. Well, poor Darwin got this huge book, written in German, of course, which Darwin couldn't master by any standard. And since the book was in the old style where the pages were not cut, we know that he didn't really get heavily into Das Kapital. It wasn't his kind of book. But what's interesting, and I point this out just to show you how sometimes it's easy to forget the obvious or to not understand that life needn't be how it is. Marx and Darwin, while they weren't neighbors, but they were both living in England. They both hung around London. They were within a train ride from each other. They never met, and yet their legacies have been phenomenal. Half the world for a while was essentially communist until it became clear that the system didn't work, and it was not nice to people, that it depended on a kind of fierce totalitarian control. Otherwise, people wouldn't listen to this sort of nonsense that they were required to. We see the same now, by the way, and I don't want to start any fuss, with China, where there is the belief that there is a Chinese way of understanding things, full stop. And if you don't like it and you come to the attention of the authorities or even a traffic cop, you're going to have trouble. Darwin hadn't that kind of restrictive position, and Marx was more open to seeing his work and what he was interested in as a contribution to science, which is why, after all, he sent his very heavy Das Kapital to Marx in London, I think, or maybe it was his home in rural England. But I would just like to mention these two major figures because it seems to me that those people, such as here in Cafe, who spend so much time, energy, skill, and affection for their fellow human beings, should realize and acknowledge that they're part of a tradition of trying to understand this complicated species that we are. And hence, when I was teaching at the University of British Columbia, I always had a course that dealt with biology and behavior. And this was seen as somewhat radical, and it was radical because social scientists were not supposed to know a single thing about biology. That was for zoology. That was biologists' work, different. But we remain part of the animal kingdom. And clearly, one of the terrible features of our immediately current lives is that we're being attacked by another species, and we're so far doing rather badly. But be that as it may, biology is the name of any game, and we ignore it at our peril. Now, this happens to be a particular issue with men's and women's rights, because for a long time, and it still persists, heaven knows, the argument of some, let's call them feminist, or I can't think of a more defining term, but there was the view that all sex differences were the result of toxic masculinity, the power of advertising, the prejudice of men, and the fear of women, etc., etc. A lot of that is, as we know, true. And it is true, for example, that in the United States, the best universities in the 19th century wouldn't admit women. Harvard, Princeton, Yale. It wasn't until 1969 that Princeton admitted women. And there are various reasons for this. One of them, which has been not very well understood, is that the university systems were part of the mating recruitment process. And if you were a Princeton guy, you would hang out with girls who went to Wellesley. And that was how the class system worked. And I can't go into it now. It's very detailed, but it's amazing how this worked. The Canadian pattern was somewhat different, where at McGill, where I was, there certainly were very evident women, and very talented and boisterous and effective and scholarly ones. And the role of the university in the mating system was not quite so clear as in the United States. One small fact I just remembered, there was a paper written in the 50s by a sociologist who showed that parents of girls got very alarmed when the state colleges, University of Arkansas, University of Alabama, University of Texas, became very desirable places to go. And women, because they wanted to go to good schools, as anyone else would go to these schools, but their mothers were not convinced that the quality of mates that they would have available was appropriate, and they set up a set of sororities that were directly connected practically and symbolically to fraternities. So once the universities became open to wider arrays of people, the families were very concerned about the reproductive options of their daughters. And they wanted to make sure that their daughters not only did well at the university, that's why they were sending them there, but did well in the later phases, the longer phases of life, marriage, and raising children, if that's what they elected to do. So the university system has always been a very important part of the reproductive pattern, and I can't get into it now because it's quite complicated. But I know that at McGill, for example, it was very clear that there were fraternities and sororities, and these all had implications for mate selection. And this was very often a hot and heavy matter, but that's how the system worked. In any case, let me come back to Marx and Darwin, but you can understand that my mention of Marx and Darwin in the same sentence finds its practical position in, for example, the university party, males and females in courtship, sorting out who's desirable, who's got what advantages, disadvantages, religious, monetary, talent, etc., etc. But this now drives me, because I didn't look at the time. I don't know what time I started. Maybe I have already gone too long. But one thing that we have to consider when we deal with the issues that are in the forefront of the concerns of CAFE, which is equity in social distribution of assets, resources, opportunities, and so on, is that this issue of who do you marry and why Who do you not marry and why? Who do you have children with or not have children with and why remains an absolutely vital central issue. I was struck by a recent news article in the New York Times which said that for the first time, according to the data, the national data that were accumulated by the journalists at the Times, for the first time, more women were employed in the labor force than men. This struck me as remarkable, just historically, but also, given that I knew I was going to be talking with the men and women who are there, whom I can't see, this is actually really very important because it leads me back to a different but critical angle. If you look at Marx and Darwin, Marx was concerned with production, Darwin with reproduction, and never the twain shall be separated. They always go together. And if I have a question or a challenge to pose to the members who are here, the question would be, what can men do to be attractive to women so that they too, the men, could have the opportunity or the option to reproduce? Darwin's insight was that reproduction is the name of the game. And if you have bright plumage and you're a bird, you're more likely to be able to fertilize the female, who may be very plain. Compare the peacock with they're just innumerable examples of how the female chooses mates based on what's clearly a role or a predictor of skillful reproduction or adult life, even if you're a peacock, which is involved with reproduction. Let me come back to something that is very local, which is stores where you go to buy diamonds when you want to get married. In Canada, the main one is Burke's. At least it was in Montreal, and I would walk by it longingly and look at all these very expensive things. In the windows, I didn't understand really what the function was, but the function was very clear. A young man wanting to marry a woman had to provide her a diamond ring. It's called an engagement ring. And the protocol, and I'm sure it's major differently formulated now, protocol was that a young man courting a woman, wanting to marry her, once he'd fulfilled all the other requirements, he had to provide a ring that cost him 2 months' salary, because this was an indication to the female that he really valued her. He wasn't crazy. He may be crazy about her, but he wasn't financially crazy, because 2 months' salary is a lot of money, particularly if you're a starting out young man in whatever your job is. But the diamond ring, the engagement ring, was a sign that you are now off the market, the reproductive market, and you were committed to beginning a relationship with another person, mostly with of the other sex, and then you would have children. This was the system. You can accuse the people who did this of being prosaic, and you could, if you were Simone de Beauvoir, accuse all the women of being members of the second sex, and certainly there was evidence that in many ways they were. And certainly there was a lot of horrible hostility and unfairness in all of these arrangements. But the fact was that there was a link between production and reproduction, which is kind of clearly reflected in the engagement ring. Now, you will probably be sitting there thinking, what the hell is this dumb guy talking about engagement rings for? I thought we were talking about men. Well, how many men are now able to collect the money to attract or provide the dowry, as it were? This is a male dowry, which will attract the female that the man wants. And the challenge that CAFE has is to assist men and women to better calibrate their behavior so that if they want to, they can engage in one of the features of the two Marx Darwin worlds, not only be productive, but also reproductive. And this is one of the profound challenges which certainly exists for individuals and for whole communities. I know that there are ways that while the law is sex neutral, nonetheless, it is possible, and certainly so in the U.S., that there are advantages that females have, as they used to have non-advantages. But in universities where I worked, there were women's studies programs, and I think there were hundreds of women's studies programs and scarcely any male studies programs. And I happen not to be particularly enamored of the women's studies because they often were pro-female and anti-male. And the phrase toxic masculinity keeps coming up in all of the literature. I don't want to get into that because A, it's boring, and B, we've passed by that. We're done, finished, no more toxic anything. Let's now deal with how humble organisms can make their lives in a complicated and demanding world. And this is equally so for men and women. And so women now have to go through, for example, a university, and they mostly used to, at least in the American culture, used to say a ring by spring. In the final year, fourth year of university, by the spring you had a ring. Remember that engagement ring. And this was because the young woman had taken advantage of the system that was set up with sororities and meetings and dances and all that. And she selected or was selected, and mutually there was selection made, a couple formed, and then they went through life in the predictable way. Well, this ain't predictable anymore. And if we look through the world, we see that, and we can discuss it, it would take days, birth rates are down. And of course, this is obviously a direct consequence of the pill. I think this has been really badly studied and not well understood. But the fact is that men and women now can have sexual relations without the fear of pregnancy per se. And something else, by the way, if there are any, I remember when I was at college, one of the issues that occasionally would come up and it was talked about very sort of behind the scenes was about young women who got pregnant and nominated a particular male as the husband, potential husband. Once you had testing, this genetic testing or medical testing, this was no longer possible. We know for a fact that, for example, in 18th century, early 19th century England, about a third to a half of marriages occurred less than 9 months after the wedding. So the shotgun marriage was a fairly common romantic pattern in those days. And if you look at drama, movies of the 1950s in Europe and America and so on, it's still an important factor. It was still. It no longer is. And now if somebody, a young woman were come up to a guy and say, hey, Chester, I got great news for you. You're going to be a dad. And he says, a dad? Really? What about Norman? What about Albert? What about the other males that I suspect or I know or I make it up you were a partner of? How then can I take responsibility for this? It may seem like a small matter, and it is, but in the turbulent meanderings of adolescent males and females, it was a major difference that suddenly it was discovered that you couldn't just get pregnant and assume that it was some other person than the possible father. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But you can understand, I trust, how this got articulated in the lives of men and women seeking to figure out how they could have some fun and also, if they were so inclined, get a blue box from Burke's with a ring in it. For people who are poorer, and people who are poorer are never adequately understood or celebrated for the courage and skill that they use to make do with limited resources, but nonetheless to live. It might not be a diamond ring, but it might be a Big Mac that they offer to a female or male. This now works both ways. But the system, the peacock with the feathers is the male, and the little plain-looking chickeny female, all she cares about is being healthy and being adroit at getting the male with the greatest plumage. Well, this obviously doesn't apply to humans as directly. On the other hand, it's not totally irrelevant, and it's hard to deny that some youngster getting a new car, or more likely a flashy used car, will go riding up and down Main Street in order to advertise to the young ladies of the town that he's got what it takes. Well, I don't know what our timing is, Justin. I clearly have talked, I guess, for 35, 40 minutes. You run a problem when you get a professor, because we tend to think in minimal 60-minute terms, but maybe I should just leave the microphone open to whoever else may want to say something, criticize. Don't be abusive, but let's be pleasant. And remember that when we're talking about this matter of production and reproduction, we're talking about some changes that are going on everywhere in our world, everywhere. The Japanese are barely replacing each other. They don't like immigrants, so they have some genuine problems about their labor forces, which is why they are so good at robots. The Russian population is falling rapidly. North America seems to be reproductively prosperous in some measure because of immigration, usually carefully controlled or managed immigration. But I don't want to get into that except to say that these mighty questions of sex and evolution are no farther away than next week's high school prom, if there is one. Now there's, of course, no school anywhere practically, so I don't know what people are doing for reproductive organization or systematic attention to reproductive options. In any event, Boy, I've talked for a long time, and I'm afraid you hadn't a choice. You volunteered, after all, to come in for this punishment, but maybe you have some sensible and not sensible, but real things that you would like to add.
Okay, great. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot to discuss, and as Professor Tiger has made clear, this is meant to be something of a dialogue. So let's go to questions. I will ask that you just keep your question or comment concise, just so that we can squeeze in as many as possible. We're going to go for about 20 minutes. And as I said earlier, if you don't want your identity to be known when we post this to we post this online, it is live streaming to YouTube, and it will also go up on Facebook. Simply change your name to your initials at this time, so that when I call on you and then give you the ability to speak, you won't be known to the wider community. So thank you again, Dr. Tiger, and we are going to take questions. Put your hand up through the mechanism on Zoom if you would like to make a short comment or pose a short question to Dr. Tiger. Okay, so we're going to go to, so I hope you're okay if I speak your name. I'll just use your first name, but Phil, let me just bring you in here. Go ahead, Phil. You may need to unmute yourself.
Oh, all right. I was going to ask a question on behalf of a fellow in the chat on YouTube, and that is, what would Dr. Tiger's opinion be about the MGTOW developments?
I'm sorry, which developments?
MGTOW, M-G-T-O-W, you know, men going their own way.
Men going their own
way.
Oh, meaning what?
Oh, it's sort of
going
a movement.
Their own way.
Sort of a movement amongst mostly younger men, but men who decide not to get married, and they just live for themselves. They see marriage as a bad deal. Divorce rate 50% or more. They get bad outcomes in family court and all that. And
sure, okay, I get it. I thank you. It's a very important point, and it's related to, again, the availability of contraception for both males and females. It used to be that only males had condoms and could really control their contraception patterns. Females could have diaphragms or the pill, or rather the mainly diaphragms, and there were, of course, condoms. But I suspect that the pill has had a very considerable impact on making that organization or that posture you talk about, men sort of on their own, possible. I was having dinner in a restaurant in New York City, and it was a crowded restaurant, and there were 4 women, obviously winner women. You know, they were well-dressed, and they'd obviously got jobs in advertising agencies or buying dresses for Hudson's Bay or whatever they were doing. They were well-off women, and they talked the entire dinner. I mean, same time as I was having my dinner, all by myself, by the way. I had nobody to talk to or complain about anything to. In any case, they were talking about their unhappy sex lives. And we don't mean just genital sex in the broader sense of sexuality. And one woman said very heavily, you know, I find I do a lot of losers. And I was struck by the phrase "I do," because that's, of course, what you're supposed to say when you get married. But here she used it to indicate that she knew she was making a compromise when she hung out with Jerry rather than, or Bill or whatever. But she knew that he was not Mr. Right. He maybe be Mr. All Right, but he wasn't Mr. Right. And these are the kinds of issues that men have to face. And you've identified in your question a number of men who essentially, you can look at it this way, given up. They've given up on women, they've given up on their societies, and in a certain sense, they've given up on themselves. And it would seem to me that one of the vital and new and important activities of CAFE is to make it possible for men not to give it up, not to give up on themselves, to see their community as a place of potential warmth and harmony, and not abuse them for being toxic males, having to go to the gym to get big muscles so they can feel that they're actually male, when all they have to do is look between their legs and discover that that's what they are. Well, that's not a direct answer to your question, but it raises some questions in any case.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
Yeah, you're happy with that? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question. Anybody else have a question for Dr. Tiger? Please put your hand up. Okay, I see Paul with a question. Paul, hold on a second.
Did you want me?
You are coming in as Paul. Not sure why the name is incorrect. We're going to go to to Joachim. I see Joachim has a question. Go ahead, Joachim. You may need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, Professor Tiger. Here's Joachim from Houston. How are you doing? Great talk. Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm from Germany, and so we have a little bit a different perspective on marriage and living together. I don't know if you know that probably 30 to 50% of people live together. They have kids, and they live long term together without being married, right? So they just like to keep the government, the legal stuff, and also the church out of the private things. And that's why they don't marry. So it's probably something in between marriage and MGTOW. What do you think about that approach?
Well, Germany is a free country, and a lot of countries are now free. And if that's how people want to live, that's fine. There's the sort of straightforward thing, so long as they don't beat each other and abuse children, and they pay a reasonable amount of taxes and don't drive the Germans do drive fast, but drive reasonably skillfully, then that's okay. And I would agree with that. There's just, I have no intention of advertising that people should do a Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch scheme with 2.3 children and all of that. But what you say is interesting, because people choose to do something which is not easy. It's not easy to spend a life, or a good part of one's life, with one person rather than 100 or 2 or 7, and raise children, which is, on the one hand, wonderful, but on the other hand, heavy lifting and responsible. And you better get it right, because you don't want to be a disappointed parent of a child you raised poorly. So now I come from Quebec, grew up in Montreal, where the power of the church was overwhelming. And for example, when I was a kid, I would work at a drugstore delivering messages. People would phone to the drugstore, and I'd get a message to take to a place. And I quickly realized something very important. If I was delivering cigarettes Or if I was delivering contraceptives, I'd get a big tip because it allowed people to do what they thought they should do and which the state controlled. And it was really very easy to ignore completely what the church did in Quebec. And it was one of the most drastically conventional or authoritarian churches in the world, in fact, in Catholicism. And so in Quebec, when in the early 60s, the whole system broke down, the church lost tremendous credibility. Montreal, I think, still has more churches per capita than any other city. But I take your point, and it seems to me that so long as you don't scare the horses, you can live the way you want.
Right on. Thank you.
Hello? Justin?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted all that time. I was just asking if anybody else had any questions. Not seeing any. I did have one for you while we're waiting for others to come up with their questions. The male bonding concept, can you tell us a little bit about how you arrived at your insights into male bonding?
Well, from monkeys. When I got interested in this whole issue, through the Canada Council, I got a summer grant to go to England where they were doing some of the best work on human biology. And one of the people I called was Desmond Morris, who was the curator of mammals at the London Zoo. It was a very important job, and he's since been a very important writer for many years. But I called him and said I was interested in male behavior, and because I thought it hadn't been properly understood or properly studied. And he said, that's interesting because we have some real problems in the zoo with males fighting. And if you can help us understand this, we'd be grateful. Of course, I couldn't at the time, but what I could see was that males formed groups, and they would defend their groups, they would provide favors to their groups, but the relationship that males had with each other was different than the ones they had with females, and importantly, very different than the relations females had with females. And it seemed to me that gender as a phenomenon was quite important in forming people's non-sexual social bonds. And then I began looking, of course, at history of armies and secret societies and sports. You know, I come from, again, as I've now mentioned too often, from Montreal, where, as in any Canadian city, the hockey team is an epical indication of the male power, male skill in the community. And there's a reason why sports have been so important, because they permit groups of men to interact with each other competitively, usually with rules, and work out a pecking order. So the I remember being on a airplane going to Toronto about 3 or 4 years ago, and as we were landing, the steward on the plane said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Toronto, home of the 1967 Stanley Cup champions," which was a matter of enormous embarrassment to him and apparently to a lot of other Torontonians. But the sports skill was reflective of the importance of the city. And so I decided that all these things and secret societies and initiation ceremonies, all of these things were very interesting and hadn't been put into a structure, into a context. And I thought, well, let's try this, because certainly there are differences between how male primates interact with each other than they do with female primates and female primates. And so I decided to do this, and it was quite a simple-minded book, but it was, I must say, with both a mixture of pride and embarrassment, it was a great success, and it was published in, I guess, 10, 11 languages, and it dealt with the fundamental biology, behavioral biology of men and women in a way that was new and different, not necessarily better, but a little different. Oddly enough, the next book I wrote with a colleague of mine, Robin Fox. It was a book called The Imperial Animal, and it dealt with the basic biology of Homo sapiens, not the biology of digestion and all that, but the behavioral, social interaction. And that, again, was a very successful book and went into many languages. And just a month ago, I got a letter from a Russian guy who's a fan of the book, who's been translating it and says, we need this in Russia. We need it. We need it. Will you write a new introduction? So I immediately contacted my colleague, Robin Fox, and we thought it was kind of amusing because we were very vilified for writing that book because of its emphasis on biology. And here the Russians, 60 years after the fact or so, were wanting to translate it because these two gentlemen, there were two who were doing this, thought that the Russians needed it. They needed to see that their behavior was primate behavior, and they should understand the sources of it and what the consequences of their form of government were.
We have a question from a YouTube viewer. So I'm just going to read it because that individual isn't able to join us on Zoom. This individual asks, there's a real sense of dissatisfaction and also an over-expectation of what relationships should be. How can a more realistic approach be actualized?
Oh, well, with care and difficulty, it's not easy. There has to be some sympathetic structures in the community that make intimate connections doable and not unpleasant or criminal. For example, you could say that if two homosexual men want to have a romantic relationship, there's no reason why they shouldn't do so, and the community should let them do it as long as they're not harming anybody or doing this in a graceless and unpleasant manner. Similarly with any kind of sexual arrangement. But the fact is that life is not simple, and it's certainly not daily dreamy. And as a consequence, there usually have to be systems and structures. Churches are very important in doing this, and rules about, for example, if you're a pious Catholic, you just can't get divorced, end of story. And so that means that if you are Catholic and married and you don't particularly like the conditions, well, you bear with it, or I don't know what you do, but nothing is easy, but some things are wonderful. And certainly people who have children and families seem to really like them and like doing it, and will spend 40 years of their lives working, selling auto parts in order to be able to pay for the pizza for some kids and a spouse. Well, that's a form of heroism, and it usually says something about the priorities of the species. Reproduction is really important. And Darwin understood this. Marx didn't give a hoot about reproduction. He was more interested in production. And one of the sad features of the Marxist history is that Marx's two daughters both committed suicide.
So we have two hands up. If we can make really quick questions out of those two individuals who'd like to speak up, or Dr. Tiger, are you okay to take two more really quick questions?
Well, I realize I have to be quick in answering, so I'll do my best.
Okay, we did promise Dr. Tiger that we would cap questions at 20 minutes, so let's do these real fast. We've got Dean who's going to join us right now. Go ahead, Dean. May need to unmute yourself.
Unmuted.
Go for it.
Marriage seems to be doing really well for the middle and upper class and seems to be doing really poorly for the lower socioeconomic individuals. My observation, for what it's worth, is that they are the young females who get pregnant need to find someone to assist them to provide the food, clothing, and shelter. They're now marrying the government instead of a male. They're finding the government more successful at providing them the food, clothing, and shelter. How can males compete
Well,
with
you know, that's of course an accurate observation, but I would point out that perhaps the most important story of our culture is the story of the birth of Jesus. And Mary had no one to help her. And so she went, like any animal, she went to the stable to become a mother. And there's a reason why we celebrate Christmas every year in many cultures, because it is the basic problem of the species, which is how do you protect and enable females to bear children and then protect them afterwards so that the children become the adults of the community. That's what Christmas is really about.
Okay, and our last question is going to go to Marwan. Okay, Marwan, please mute yourself. Go ahead with your question.
Okay, my question is, how can males continue to participate in the mating ritual in our society? I understand the value of families and children and so on, but if the mating itself is seen in a negative light, and if there are severe consequences for those actions, how can males continue to do that or participate in it in our society?
Well, the unfortunate answer to that directly is with great difficulty and not much help. And so when kids go to school and they're told that, I mean, for example, when my book on males came out, the warmest response I had to the publication, The Decline of Males, was from the mothers of boys. They said, you know, my son's been at school for 10 years and he's had his hand up always, but the teachers will only recognize the girls. And that's clearly wrong. And but it's part of the culture we live in which toxic masculinity is the flavor of the decade or the century, actually. So first of all, your point about class differences is very important. I think you'll find that people who are poor in every kind of way, because this is not a good society for equality. That just isn't. And societies try one way or another to reduce the differences between wealthy and non-wealthy people, but don't necessarily do it well. Canada seems to do it rather better than south of the border, and that's because it's had a socialist party for years, and the political system is organized both provincially and federally in a way that reduces some of the obvious glaring inequalities, though nonetheless, I know, again, when I was at college, and you knew that a young woman named Redpath was different because her family owned all the sugar in Quebec and probably Ontario. So those differences were real. And your question, I'm afraid, doesn't have an easy answer, but it's better to continue to ask the question than to give up asking it.
Marwan, thank you very much for the question. We are going to have to close there for the night. I'm sorry, everybody, who wasn't able to get your questions. There were a couple of you in the chat box there with questions that we're not going to have time to get to, but we'll keep this stream open for 5 or 10 minutes after Dr. Tiger and I sign off. So if you want to converse with each other there, you're welcome to answer one another's question. I will also say that we have our next guest lined up for not next week, but the week after that. That's going to be Professor Emily Douglas. I'm really excited about her presentation. I've done a lot of research into domestic violence for a number of research reports that CAFE's put together. Her name comes up more than really anybody else in the scholarship. She is predominantly interested in the help-seeking behaviors of male victims of intimate partner violence and domestic violence. So she's somebody not to miss. She's the head of the Department of Social Science and Policy Studies at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. We'll send out more information about that. Then not next week, we'll be taking a break, but the following Thursday is when she's agreed to join us. But for now, I want to thank Professor Lionel Tiger for joining us. I want to thank all of you for joining us very much. Thanks for all your interesting questions and comments. If you do have any concerns with your name being seen on YouTube and Facebook, let me know. But I hope, as was made clear earlier, that you knew to change your name to your initials if that was going to be a concern, which will help us get the recording of this out as fast as we can. And also a reminder to visit our website, menandfamilies.org / I think it's online programs. I'm just going to double check that real fast for a list of all the different programs that we've now rolled out online. Yes, I believe that's the URL. So we've now moved all of our various legal clinic, fathering programs, counseling, support groups. They're all available online. You can sign up for those. The instructions are there on the website at menandfamilies.org. And so again, thanks so much, Dr. Tiger, for joining us tonight, and to all of you for making this such an enjoyable and enlightening conversation. I'm going to wish you a good evening, and we'll keep the chat open for the next 5 to 10 minutes. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Professor Tiger, thanks again so much.
That was appropriate, you thought?
I thought so very much. Yes, I think everybody enjoyed it. Appreciate it very much.
Good questions, sensible questions, and I appreciate that.
Yes, I thought it was.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I guess I'll see you, or not see you, depending on quarantine laws, in November.
I hope we'll be seeing each other in the fall. Exactly. Okay, have a good night, everybody. Thanks so much. We're going to end there.